You know, I found that in working with AI, it's very, very easy to get lost in the weeds, as it were. Not now because the technology is useless or because it's somehow obviously bad. There's a lot of talk going on about AI, but because it's bloody so astonishingly useful that one can very quickly begin to use it in ways that are not entirely conscious. In general, the world has come to speak about AI as artificial intelligence. Now, that phrase has already settled into public language with remarkable force. It rolls now so easily off the tongue, and because we've become used to it. But the more I work with AI and the more I read and listen to different thinkers trying to describe what this technology actually is, the more I find myself drawn to another phrase, namely artificial communication. And for me, artificial communication feels much closer to the truth of the experience that I'm encountering when I interface with any large language model. Now, I'm not suggesting that the phrase artificial intelligence is going to disappear anytime soon. It won't. It's already won the naming battle, if you like, in the wider culture. And yet, there's something really important in the resistance that I feel when I try to say artificial communication instead. The phrase doesn't move quite as smoothly, like it makes the mind pause. It doesn't offer the same sort of glamour. It doesn't summon images of a new mind or a new god or oracle or a new species of intelligence coming over the horizon. And for me, I think that's exactly why it matters. When we call AI artificial intelligence, we're already half invited to imagine that something like a mind stands behind the interface. We begin to think of it in terms of intelligence, agency, replacement, competition, superiority, threat, and destiny, even. We're drawn into the drama of whether the machine can think, whether it knows, whether it understands, whether it will one day become conscious, and invariably, whether it will replace us. But when we call it artificial communication, or at least when I call it artificial communication, when I think of it in terms of artificial communication, the emphasis changes. The question becomes less, is there a mind in there, and more, what is happening in this communicative exchange? Now, that shift might sound subtle, but in my own experience, it changes the entire posture of attention. AI communicates, it responds, it generates language. It reflects, organizes, compresses, expands, suggests, and rephrases. It can appear astonishingly intelligent. It can help clarity. It can help clarify half-formed intuitions in a very short space of time. But that does not mean that there is some type of subject or agent behind the words. The fact that communication occurs does not necessarily mean that an inner owner is present. And this is where the matter becomes more interesting and for me, also a bit more dangerous. Because if AI can communicate without there being a conscious self behind the communication, then AI begins to reveal something not only about machines, but about us. It unsettles the old assumption that communication, language, authorship, and agency must always belong to some inner sovereign owner. It makes visible the possibility that what we call self may also be an interface, a functional, useful, deeply intimate interface, granted, but not the ground of experience itself. This is a wider field that I'm beginning to explore in a larger project I'm calling The Last Idol. Human beings seem to have a long history of mistaking interfaces for reality. We create images, gods, systems, nations, profiles, technologies, identities, and selves through which reality becomes more navigable, let's say. The interface itself is not the problem. We need interfaces. Without them, we couldn't speak, remember, organize, create, relate, or act in any coherent way. The problem begins when the interface becomes idolized, when the map, if you like, is mistaken for the territory. And the most intimate of these idols may very well be the sense of self here, the self that we take to be the organizing driver in us, the ghost in the machine, if you like. We identify with that self interface. We mistake it, I feel, for what we are. From there, we identify with our thoughts, our stories, our wounds, our roles, our ambitions, our failures, our status, our tribe, our beliefs, our memories, our labels. In short, the interface becomes an identity. Once that happens, like, suffering begins to organize around it, you know? The constructed self has to be defended and healed or completed, admired, protected, improved, purified, and oftentimes avenged, you know? Now, this is where AI becomes important, I feel. It can either deepen this process of identification or it can help us see through it. In my own use of AI, I've noticed both possibilities. On the one hand, AI can be an extraordinary resource. I can bring an intuition to any large language model and within minutes receive distinctions, structures, summaries, counterpoints, reading paths, and formulations that would have taken me much longer to arrive at alone. Now, this is genuinely helpful, lads. It can widen the field of attention, it can reduce confusion, and it can help something half seen become clearer. But there's another side to this. Because of the speed and fluency of the technology, it's very, very easy to get way out ahead of myself. One can begin to experience interaction almost like a wave of constant clarification, if you get me. Each answer generates another question. Each distinction opens another door. Each insight produces the desire for the next insight. And before long, you're no longer necessarily learning in any meaningful way. You're just receiving. One is consuming. You're just riding the wave. And let's face it, the wave feels good. There's a dopamine quality to it. There's a sense of acceleration of being carried somewhere. The model can appear to move you from A to B with almost frictionless speed. But the danger is that the very friction it removes is the friction through which real learning, authorship, embodiment, and conscious learning develop. Human understanding is not only a matter of receiving correct information. It requires encounter. It requires resistance. It needs resistance. It requires the discomfort of not knowing, the slow pressure of trying to say something in one's own words, the awkwardness of getting it wrong, the bodily labor, let's say, of staying with a thought long enough for it to become lived rather than merely understood. Now, AI can help with this, but it can also help us bypass it. And for me, this is the big hinge. If I use AI merely to get past the difficulty, then I may not be becoming more conscious at all or learning anything. I may simply be outsourcing the very encounter that would have helped consciousness and learning deepen. I may be using the interface not to see more clearly, but actually to absence myself from the felt sense of being here. Now, for me, this is one of the central dangers. AI can become the ultimate assistant in this regard, not only in practical sense, but in a more existential sense. It can assist us, quite frankly, in avoiding ourselves. It can help us avoid the resistance, the boredom, the uncertainty, the slowness, the vulnerability, and the discomfort that are part and parcel of genuine human development and learning. This is why the distinction between artificial intelligence and artificial communication for me matters so much. Like, if I think of AI primarily as artificial intelligence, I am much more likely to relate to it rather, as a source of mind-like power. I may unconsciously treat it as an authority, an oracle, an agent, a substitute, a superior intelligence, or even a replacement self. I may ask it to think for me without noticing that I have done so. But if I think of it as artificial communication, I'm much more likely to remain aware of the relational field. Something is happening between the human and the interface. There is language, response, selection, interpretation, framing, and attention, but there is not necessarily some owner behind the machine's words, obviously. And perhaps more disturbingly, there may not be the kind of owner behind my words here that I had previously imagined. Now, that doesn't mean that authorship disappears. It, it doesn't mean responsibility disappears. And it doesn't mean that the human being vanishes, obviously, On the contrary, it may make responsibility more serious. If there is no little sovereign self sitting behind the process, then authorship becomes less a matter of ownership and more a matter of participation, discrimination, care, and responsibility. And this is where AI-assisted creativity becomes so interesting. Used unconsciously, it can become another idol. Used consciously, it may become a way of seeing through idolatry in the truest sense of the word itself. The human can work creatively with AI without mistaking AI for the author, but the human can also remain the author without mistaking authorship for proof of a sovereign inner owner. This is the delicate middle path for me. AI contribution is real, but it does not require a machine's self, so to speak. Human authorship is real, but neither does it require a belief in a separate inner controller. The work emerges through a field, body, memory, attention, language, source material, intuition, machine output, human selection, revision, taste, responsibility, and lived experience. To see this clearly is not to diminish creativity, it is to remove the idol from it. This is why, the image of the wave that I referred to earlier feels really relevant here to me. Working with AI can feel like getting on top of a wave, as I said. It rises quickly, it carries thought forward, it can produce a sense of momentum, discovery, even exhilaration. But obviously, no real wave peaks forever. A wave has cycles, it rises, gathers, crests, moves, and invariably and inevitably breaks. It returns to the sea and to the shore. Human beings are living systems. We're not built for endless peak experience. We need rhythm, limit, rest, difficulty, ground, and return. If AI is used as a way to remain endlessly on the crest of the wave, then something in the living rhythm is violated. The system overheats, the body gets left behind. The human being becomes more fragmented, not more conscious. So the question then is not simply whether AI is good or bad. I mean, that's just too crude a question. The better question is, how are we being invited to encounter it? AI can either help us become more conscious of how we use interfaces, or it can become the ultimate interface into which we disappear. Now, that sentence to me seems to be a lot closer to the heart of the matter. If AI is encountered as artificial communication, then it may help reveal the interface as interface. It may help us see how easily we project mind, agency, authority, and selfhood onto communicative surfaces. It may also help us see how we have done the same thing with our own thoughts, identities, and stories. But if AI is idolized as artificial intelligence in a deeper sense, as a sort of new mind or oracle, a new master interface, then it may intensify the very confusion it has the potential to reveal. Instead of freeing us from the old bind, it may become its most seductive form. And for me, the future may depend, at least in part, on that distinction. Not because a change of terminology alone will save us, or even that we need saving, because it won't, but because language shapes attention, and attention shapes the kind of relationship we enter into. To call AI artificial communication is to remind ourselves that we are dealing with an interface, a powerful interface, yes, a transformative interface, most certainly, but still an interface nonetheless. And perhaps the task before us is not to destroy, attack, or vilify our interfaces, but to stop mistaking them for reality. The wave has to break. The human being has to return to the ground. The interface must be seen as interface. Only then can it serve life rather than become another place where we disappear.